everyone, welcome to the Sports Doyen. I'm Kushagra, and today I'm joined with Mr. Rob Harris. First of all, thank you so much, Rob, for joining us here on the channel, and we're extremely grateful for having you, having a personality like you on the channel. We followed you very keenly over the past years. As we were having a chat before the interview as well, you were in India 3 years back, so one would like to think you have a little bit of a taste of the Indian, how do I say, perspective towards football is. So, without wasting much time, I'd like to. This is more of a personal question as well. I just wanted to know, and I'm sure our viewers want to know, how did you get into this industry? As in, was sports journalism, sports broadcasting, sports presenting something that always attracted you, or was it something on the lines of you wanted to be a sportsman as a child, and this was one of the vicarious ways, because this is one of the reasons I sort of got into this, so I sort of self project that on other people as well. So were there any childhood icons who made you follow this particular field, or was it something that you had decided from very early?
Great to join you from a deceptively sunny London. I don't know how long we're going to get this good weather continuing for. Yeah, I mean, it's always great to have a chat with people to try to give a sense of perspective over just what the journey is. And, it's pretty amazing the fact that in recent weeks alone, I've been to like Champions League final, the start of the Premier League, all behind closed doors, obviously, with no fans in. So it is a unique pair of eyes on the world of sport. And it's probably a world that I never necessarily imagined I would be reporting on. A big sports fan, big football fan, always. And I think I realised quite early on I was not necessarily going to have a career in playing football, however much enjoy actually playing it. Although, fortunately, some recent experiences, like a recent experience has been playing at Wembley in the last year. And it was actually through reporting on more general matters, more generalist, more news, more other matters that actually got me into covering sport actually fully professionally. And that opportunity came through the Associated Press, where I was originally, reporting across many different matters, including things like terrorism and some political matters as well. And it was actually some of the more significant issues in sport and football that kept me covering football even more. Some of the big issues around things like FIFA, some of the ownership battles of clubs as well, and the ability to marry that with reporting on the joyful moments in stadiums, on the pitch, and with the actual players. Creates an interesting balance, being able to reflect how the game is run and what actually happens on the pitch itself.
If you touched about the UCL, the Champions League last stages that were held in Lisbon. We know you were there. You were there covering the final 8 and the quarterfinals, semi-finals and the finals, of course. So how was it? How was the experience in Lisbon? The tournament was fantastic. Personally, I'm not a fan of the added crowd noise that they put on all television channels, on all sports broadcasters. Now that is happening. You must know about the IPL as well. IPL has started in the UAE. They've done the same thing there. They've done the same thing. They did the same thing for the US Open for the final stages as well. It is not something the fans are really enjoying as such. At least from what I've spoken with people. Another aspect is, as a media room, you must be so used to interacting with the fellow professionals, getting there, scratching their brains, and getting their thoughts on what is happening, what may happen, what are the recent controversies. Given the COVID restrictions, I'm sure all of that must have been incredibly restricted, must have been an isolated experience for you as well. So how was that experience in Lisbon?
Yeah, you talk about the fake crowd noise. I mean, here for the cricket, they were using something called the Lord's Hum on some of the radio commentary in particular. So just gently there in the background, so it wasn't complete silence. And it was really unusual being in Lisbon. I mean, I'd been to sort of 6 weeks of Premier League games where you got used to there being no crowd, but it never felt any more joyful or something you wanted to see continue. And it felt surreal the whole time, when I was at things like Leicester's game against Manchester United, which was an effective Champions League playoff, such a consequential game, and that fans would really transform the occasion, maybe in Leicester's favour. And then you get to the Champions League final. Now, obviously, it was a very different type of tournament. The fact we didn't just roll into town for the final, the single game, but we had the 2 weeks, the quarterfinals, the semi-finals. And normally there'd be this huge buzz around the city. When I was in Madrid a year earlier, there were thousands of Liverpool fans in one square, thousands of Tottenham fans in another, a main area where there was entertainment. And, you felt you were really in a city for a big moment. You arrive in Lisbon, and I was actually staying opposite the Benfica Stadium because we had an AP broadcaster view there. And there wasn't even any branding around the stadium. There was just a few people around. And Lisbon itself was really quiet as well because, for instance, from the UK at that moment, and again now, anyone flying there would have to self-quarantine for 2 weeks on return. Fortunately for me, there was a brief gap when it was lifted, which was fortunately when I was returning from there. And then even, of course, the whole experience at the Champions League, there were no press conferences. Everything is on Zoom even when out there. There's no mix zone to speak to the players directly afterwards. So what you find journalistically is you're in the stadium and around the stadium trying to, in some ways, report still. What can I show from being out here? What can I add to people that they're not just providing and seeing on the television feeds of the games? And, for instance, one of those moments happened quite late after the final when Bayern won, and I'd actually been sitting in the stadium wondering, I'd done my initial match report, wondering how do I capture this full occasion, this really surreal moment that we hope will only be the one and only Champions League final to be played without fans. And I've got used to being at games behind closed doors. All the moments or the oddities were quite familiar, and to fans as well, that they'd read obviously loads about games being behind closed doors, so probably a sense of teething where you want to just read about the football. And then about an hour and a half after the final whistle, after the celebrations, the trophy lift, I suddenly hear this drumming noise down below, and it was Joshua Kimmich, who was just coming back onto the pitch drumming with Alaba and Gnabry, and they were just walking out onto the centre circle on their own. They just sat in the centre circle, clearly just reflecting on what they'd just done. And then the stadium lights went out and they still sat there in the centre circle. So we had this really unusual thing where one of the biggest games in world sport in a year, the Champions League final, and finished. Not many people were in the stadium, even fewer by this point. Certainly there can't have been 100 people still within the stadium bowl, maybe 50 people, even less than that, were there to see this moment. So it was interesting just capturing that and writing about that then, this reflective moment at the end of the longest and most surreal and grim season perhaps in modern history. And then when out at the Champions League final as well, you're trying to see what's going on around the main square. And so as well as writing for AP, we're doing some more digital type shows as well for social media while speaking to a colleague, and we're inserting various bits of clips and things, and also some TV broadcasts as well. Unfortunately, there was a chance to actually do some face-to-face interviews, which are very rare. One was with the UEFA president, Alexander Shevrin, for half an hour, which was great to be able to have some normality in the sense of seeing a subject you're interviewing face-to-face and be able to film it properly and picture it. And also with the Leeds United owner, Andrea Radrizzani, which was fascinating because obviously we were just a few weeks away from Leeds finally returning to the Premier League after 16 years. But yeah, it was a very strange experience, and one that, sort of a privilege to sort of be one of the only few hundred people allowed into the stadium for something like a Champions League final.
Yeah, it is very interesting. You talk about
and my answers there probably shows why when I'm writing it, a sub-editor cuts down my answers, whereas I've probably spoken massive length.
No, actually, I would prefer if your answers are much longer and people don't really pay much heed to what my questions are, because of course it's you who we want to hear on this interview. And as far as the experience is concerned, you're right to say, you mentioned, I remember reading something on the lines of, after the 2013 final, it was Aryan Robin and Philip Lahm who were there near the center circle and who were reminiscing because it had been a long and tedious journey for Bayern, having lost at home the previous year, having come close again in 2010 and Van Gaal as well. So it had been a tough journey for them. So it was quite nice moment, it was a very nice picture of uh, Gnabry and Kimmich just lying down on the center circle, just trying to take it all in. It was a beautiful picture, and Bayern definitely were the deserved winners. Uh, if we move on, you spoke about the digitized platforms that I'm sure in the past 5 to 6 years they've become one of the major focuses for your work as well. But again, social media with its massive positives, which are the reach that it provides, instant access and instant reactions, that it provides, the knowledge is there at the click of your finger, at the flick of a button. All of that is there. Great. We had mentioned a little about your private life being private and that being the intention there as well. Uh, how do you cope with the not so nice and the negative comments that are there? I'm sure you must have to deal with hundreds of them on a daily basis, and maybe more. And I'm hoping not that is not the case. But someone like you at a position that you are, wherein you have to give your opinions, you have to make certain calls, whether you're writing what you're writing in your articles or what you're presenting in your shows. How do you handle everything? I'm sure there must be days when you have your ups and downs.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point when you say about, some people might dispute opinions. Actually, it's often the case where it's some fans not liking that you're focusing on certain facts and legitimate facts, or pointing out certain analytical points that are necessary around how their clubs are run, for instance. And this is not a majority of fans. It's not widespread. There are very small groups, numbers of them who have a perception of agendas, a perception of some sort of bias or determination to undermine a club, rather than just what is hopefully legitimate reporting, legitimate scrutiny. And I suppose you look at two examples recently. One is Manchester City, one is Newcastle. Now, Newcastle fans were hoping for this takeover by Saudi Arabia. That's just when I say Newcastle fans are hoping, the ones that seem to be the majority voice on social media. Obviously, there were legitimate factual points to highlight that were potentially things that would block the takeover and ultimately have thwarted the Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth fund buying the club. The fact there was the human rights issues, linked to the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the culpability or not in the chain of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and all the criticism from human rights groups there that we reflected. And obviously the sovereign wealth fund ultimately was overseen and is overseen by Mohammed bin Salman. And we knew that would play into whether the Premier League can decide whether or not to approve the takeover or not, over who was running the club and other questions over the person who might ultimately be in control. As we know, that's the situation it did end up in at the moment. Also, the fact there's the piracy issues in terms of the pirating of television broadcasts owned by Qatar's beIN Sports by a Saudi-based operation that Saudi Arabia has been accused of not doing enough to shut down. So those were all points to report on. But I think Newcastle fans in particular sort of thought we had some sort of determination to stop them breaking into the elite, to try to thwart their ambitions with Saudi Arabian money potentially to challenge at the top again. Whereas actually these were just issues that many of us in sports had covered for some years as well. And they were just coming together on this one takeover. With Manchester City, it was you could say more contentious. There was investigations into financial fair play breaches that were based around what City say, hacked or stolen documents. So Manchester City were found guilty, obviously, in February. They were banned for 2 years by UEFA for, what they saw as some potential deceptions. At the time, there's a guilty verdict. We all report on it because it's a verdict handed down. You point out, of course, that there can be an appeal. And when it comes to the appeal and they won, then we report the appeal. It's not something that has some vested interest in what the outcome might be. It's just reporting each stage of the process and where it's heading. It's not in, it's not affecting me whether or not Manchester City are in the Champions League or not, but you're just sort of following the building blocks of where potential investigation is and reporting on that. And then you get a situation, say, when the verdict comes in, that even the appeal verdict can be disputed in terms of the emphasis. Some Manchester City fans want you to focus, say, on the fact they're cleared to play in the Champions League and they weren't found to have covered up the source of income from sponsorships to comply with financial fair play. Other people, say it's legitimate to focus, of course, as we say, on the fact they were fined 10 million euros, the biggest fine, one of the biggest in football history, for obstructing the investigation. So it just shows the complexities, how also fans will read into what angle you might take in the story because you focused obviously on one part of the case, or there's an echo chamber where they don't like to see any negativity about their club. And you see the opposite of that at teams like Manchester United, where actually the fans are almost keen to read about all the negativity and they share concerns about their ownership. Whereas at some clubs, they're sort of slavishly loyal almost to their ownership, and they actually have this real deep affinity that nothing can break, and the fact that they certainly have a bond that means they would defend their ownership, whatever. Whereas other clubs, they're more willing to sort of go on the attack. Because ultimately, it's about defending, hopefully ensuring the long-term viability of clubs and the right and proper nature of how they're run.
Yeah, you've touched on the ownership structure there, and there's a small question before I get into that particular question, because that's a very interesting point, because we have seen around 5 clubs in the Greater Manchester area now facing an existential crisis now. Again, almost all of them are because of financial mismanagement by owners which have come and taken over the clubs in the recent past. I'd say last 10 years or so. And also around you speak about the whole Saudi KSA strike attempt of taking over the Newcastle United board, and over trying to buy the club from Mike Ashley, and that being rejected. Were the circumstances entirely different when the Abu Dhabi group was coming in for Man City in 2007 2008, or was it because Premier League already had their hands burned by Thaksin Shinawatra? They just wanted him gone and anyone to take over, because Shinawatra, as you remember, also wasn't in a good position. He was chucked out from the prime ministership of his country over corruption charges. Then he was jailed. So Premier League does not have a great record in terms of allowing people to take over clubs. And you speak about Manchester United and Arsenal. It's daylight robbery what's happening at those clubs. It is. I know those guys aren't involved with human rights abuses and other serious charges like that, but it is daylight robbery. One club was bought on a leveraged buyout. The other clubs bought as a nice revenue model for a new stadium that the owner is building now in the States, world-class stadium. So how do you look at these things? Do you think, especially English clubs, considering how big an entity they are in the world, and now that people are willing to go down as National League and League Two to buy clubs and build them up, the whole Salford model or the whole Forest Green model is very popular amongst millionaires, not billionaires as such, who also want to get a piece of the pie in the football pyramid.
Yeah, personally, I wouldn't use the word robbery, because they legitimately own the clubs at Arsenal and United. And what fans have said is, United in particular, are they taking out dividends from the club, which is a perfectly legal means, but obviously not something the fans want to see because it's money coming out of the club. But I think what we see at, say, a club at United and Arsenal is, they're purely capitalist. They're using debt structures that are financial mechanisms to run the club, which are perfectly legitimate, and it's a way of running many businesses. It just doesn't sit comfortably with football fans who want to see as much money as possible invested in their clubs, and in some ways their clubs run in a way that's different from, say, a supermarket chain or a technology company. But the Glazers in particular, they've used the debt markets. They funded a club in that particular way, which is a model of running businesses. And if you look at their situation, it's very clear. You have two different sides of the coin, where of course Manchester City, owned by a nation state, Manchester United, owned by capitalists, purely so in the Glazers, who have their US business operations as well. And in Manchester City, they're restricted from putting all the money they might want to into the club to spend on players because of the financial fair play rules. So however much they might want to invest in the football, which they would say then perhaps has a knock-on effect in the local economy as well, there are certain caps on what it can be done so. Whereas Manchester United, obviously, the aim is to perhaps make as much profit out of the club as possible. But of course, United have spent money just very badly over recent years on a lot of players. It's not like managers haven't had money at their disposal to sign players. The signings have just turned out pretty badly, as have some Manchester City signings as well. Mangala and others, like 40 odd million for him. And so just having money obviously doesn't necessarily guarantee results. And it comes to the question of, who do you want running the club? And when you look back to how the Manchester City takeover happened in 2008, well, I remember, hearing actually one of the reasons Thaksin Shinawatra sold the club was effectively there was some pressure from the Premier League over amnesty's concerns at the time about, human rights abuse and his leadership in Thailand. But you say, there wasn't that scrutiny on Abu Dhabi and the UAE, and obviously it's not a, democracy. There are restricted labour laws as well. And it was only really after Qatar won the right to host the World Cup that this changed. And I think we got this increased focus on human rights in sports. Yes, there had been on China ahead of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, but the constant level really was only around Qatar awarding the World Cup. And you didn't actually get that significantly before the FIFA vote in December 2010. A lot of that focused on, was there wrongdoing? Was it too hot in Qatar to host the World Cup? And it was actually the human rights groups like Amnesty that started to obviously draw attention to these matters after the vote, and they educate the journalists. We're not, experts in things like the kafala system before, or certainly not me, before Qatar won the right to host the World Cup. And obviously the fact they started to build stadiums and infrastructure meant suddenly you did have a lot more workers there, and there was a lot more projects to scrutinize, which then meant that there was this attention on that. And then obviously you look across the rest of the region as well, which hasn't had the same level of scrutiny perhaps as the Qatari labour laws, but it just shows the many dimensions of sport and the areas that we have to report into, and suddenly become sort of au fait with whether it's not just analysing the on-pitch performance, whether or not a team has to find a way of shoring up its defence or a manager's future, but also things like how a club is structured financially, its commercial operations, who is owning the club, who might really be running the club, who are the big players behind the scenes, who are the agents who perhaps have relationships with clubs, and ultimately who are the bodies at the top of the chain, and also roles of nation states and high politics and diplomacy and human rights as well.
Yes, and you're right. You're absolutely right in saying that, because it also depends on the objectives of the ownership structure as well, the owners as well. Because if you talk about a capitalist business organization owning Manchester United and Arsenal, it's the same thing with Chelsea, and you can just see a difference in the level of investment, difference in the level of involvement that the owner is taking. So you're right. It can have its pitfalls, and it can also have its positives there. So it is just sort of the hand that they were dealt, I guess. So moving on that, you've covered so many different tournaments. You've been part of so many different events as such. And if one goes and has a look over the personalities and the athletes and the sports persons, and also the dignitaries and administrators that you interviewed, the list is endless. And I'll ask you a very difficult question. I'm sure you must have been asked this multiple times. Any particular moments, any particular matches, or any particular interview that stands out for you in your career, that you often look back and, yeah, that was a nice day, Rob, you did well that day, something like that some sort of a moment, because I've seen that cover picture on your Twitter profile, the one with David, the one where he's sitting and chatting with David Beckham. I think that's an interview in process.
Yes, on the Facebook page, yeah.
Yes,
Maybe it's a bit
yes.
outdated.
Yes. So that's me. I would suggest that you keep it, because I mean, can, can anyone do better than David Beckham? It's a tough task, because he's there. He's the most, probably one of the most known personalities in the world. So yeah, something on those lines. Any particular experience that you still fondly look back at, that's one of your famous dinner stories, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually, the variety as well, being able to switch modes into sometimes it might be a more personal interview, a more an interview about something that more of a life story with a player or an athlete, something that has a deep emotional connection for them and something they want to talk about. Other times it can be an interview that's, you're trying to get news out of, you're trying to find out what's happening in a certain scenario. And other times it might have to be more of a grilling, because actually a person is under pressure, or you legitimately need to hold them to account as well. So it's interesting variety, just different types of interviews and of storytelling. And so you think of ones that that come to mind. It's always interesting to interview some players, some perhaps you don't get as much out of as you might like. You hope they're open, so you can actually talk at length to be able to glean something that people don't know, and go beyond just looking ahead to the next game and just reflecting on a match that's just happened, and getting them to sort of open up and to to talk more about their experiences. It's been great over the years to interview people like the FIFA president Gianni Infantino at times, because actually these are matters as well that he's talking about that ultimately affect players, fans, and teams on a day-to-day basis. What happens to the game? Interviewing the UEFA president a few weeks ago, again, Alexander Shevrin. A lot of people in football are hanging on his words to know what he's saying, what's his direction of travel over his thoughts on various things, and those things will be scrutinized. The Leeds owner, again, who I did recently, how actually that interview resonated really well with Leeds fans, who were fascinated to hear their owner talking about his strategy and his vision. Again, that was an interview I didn't want to just talk about transfer targets, but actually how he positions himself as an owner, his objectives for the club, and also what it's like working with Marcelo Bielsa. And he really opened up by talking about how he tells them to stress a bit less. So it was just great to get that insight. And the likes of David Beckham as well, knowing that I've interviewed him a number of times. I've interviewed Usain Bolt as well at the height of his career, and knowing actually how so many people idolised him, to actually try to give an insight into his life as well, and what drives him. And another one I did a few weeks ago, it was in depth, was, for instance, like Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov, who was the Russian doping whistleblower, the person behind some of the mass corruption of Olympic sports from the Russian perspective. And speaking to him from his hiding place in the US for an hour is a chance to speak to someone who's actually had a deep impact and effect on sport for all the wrong reasons. The fact he became embroiled in this scheme of such grand deception of one of the greatest corruption exercise of all time in sport. So yeah, I mean, and then for moments that you remember the moments like 2015 May the 27th in Zurich, being at the Boralac Hotel when FIFA members are being arrested, and being one of the only people to see one of them being dragged out, and getting amongst the only footage of that. Are certainly memorable moments in the career, and you often sort of try to reflect on some of those things when you're at World Cup finals, seeing big moments at Olympics, and also the other side of sports as well, and ultimately knowing that the world is watching. But then you get sort of satisfaction as well from doing things that I've done for for years, which is going to the annual meetings of the International Football Association board in normally in February, somewhere around the UK or in Zurich. And it's not not a big event, not many people there either from the FIFA or UK nations FAs who are on the IFAB, or many media at all. But actually those decisions are really consequential because it affects VAR, handballs and stuff. And it's actually a real way of sort of trying to inform people to let them understand all those things they get irritated about, how they might change, or we can be the voice to actually express the fans' irritations over why you're so pedantic over offsides or handballs, and try to sort of actually directly with the decision makers lead to changes. But it's interesting to have a variety, and even obviously this year I would have had the European Championship normally, so yes. The last major event football-wise I did was then the Women's World Cup in 2019, where you actually find a lot of players sometimes have a lot more to say to themselves than some of the male players, which was quite interesting. Certainly better talkers at times. Then I was at the World Athletics Championships as well in Doha last year for a couple of weeks. So that was stepping away from football for a bit to some different storytelling as well. So yeah, interesting, variety. Fortunately, that I get to experience.
Yeah, that I remember those athletic championships not being very well received with the empty stadiums and everything else. People talking about what was the whole point, and I don't know. It got a lot of negative criticism. I'd probably like to take it from Doha to the Qatar World Cup itself. We have the 2022 World Cup. You mentioned, when Qatar was awarded the World Cup, the whole background checks and the whole checks around human rights abuses for future hosts or for any kind of an entity that wants to invest in the game, that the whole checks became very, very, very intensive. We see the World Cup that's scheduled for 2022 in December. It's going to be a one of a kind again. COVID aside, we've never seen any real change as such, apart from the number of participants, which thankfully is not going to happen this time. But we can expect that in 2026. The World Cup comes in December. I think the seasons will take a break around November, if I'm not wrong. I think that would be I think October and November would be the time. I'm sure they'll give the national teams a month at least in the calendar. So, how do you see that impacting 2022? I know we are going too far ahead in the future. It's 2 years down the line right now still, and we still aren't over the COVID pandemic. So we do not know when the whole truncated schedule that we are living on right now. We've sort of tried to jumble up a few things. Try to make sure that the football goes on as an industry, as an entity, as an entertainment for its fans. How do you think this will impact? Because eventually we are going to see a fixture pile up, because either you don't play those fixtures, or if you play them, you have to sort of. We saw Pep Guardiola talk about this very, 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 very effectively. I think it was in his pre-match press conference before Wolves, when he said, the 5 sub rules, you think that only helps the top 5. Maybe you don't really understand how it goes, in depth. I'm not trying to partake from his words, but it is going to have a physical and mental impact on players. It is definitely going to have a mental impact on the consumer as well. Don't you think it's just jumbling up too many things at the same time? You have the Euros next year, you have the AFCON, then you have the Champions League every year. You have that Club World Cup, as you recently reported the day before yesterday. It's still in the doldrums. We don't know if it's going to happen, or if it's going to happen where it was happening earlier. And then you have the 2022 World Cup, and then you have all the qualifiers, the Nations League, and everything else. How do you see all, FIFA, UEFA, CONMEBOL, CONCACAF, everyone else just fitting all these pictures in the next 2 years?
Yeah, I mean, Eric Dyer was at Tottenham the other day, was also talking about this ridiculous workload on players' bodies and this all year round football we got coming up against us. Now, take the Qatar World Cup in 2022, and sometimes whenever you make some sort of legitimate points, sometimes that are non-negative, people sort of see you as some sort of apologist for the World Cup or something, but actually it's important to offer all perspectives where there are. It was a huge controversy at the time when it had to be moved from June, July 2022 to November, December, because of the summer heat, not been able to cope with staging the tournament. Air conditioning in the stadiums is something that is happening. In fact, it was actually too cold out there when I was there for the Athletics. It'd be absolutely freezing in the stadium. You step outside, it'd be 40 degrees, and you get gusts of cold air from the aircon. You know, but that decision was taken. Obviously, they bid for a Summer World Cup, but actually, maybe you could say FIFA should actually allow flexibility in terms of when a World Cup can be hosted, because otherwise you do lock out many countries around the world who could never potentially host it in June, July because of the heat. But actually now, because of the disruption to the football calendar caused by the coronavirus and where we are with this backlog or movement to the seasons, and particularly delay in starting World Cup qualifying, particularly in South America, it's going to help football potentially. The fact that the World Cup is starting late in the year in 2022, it gives this breathing space to complete qualifying and to be able to find a way of actually completing those fixture programs. Now, down the line, obviously, so many questions over what does the World Cup look like, what state are we in with the pandemic as well, and fans moving around the world. And we're 2 years away, and we're only 6 months into this pandemic at the moment. And obviously, there are financial concerns as well around the world. What impact does that have on things like corporate fans going to World Cup, which is a big source of revenue, regular fans as well, being able to afford those trips. And you look at the World Cup now, and obviously to the moment the first ball is kicked off in Qatar, the controversies will continue. There will be people that obviously question the right in terms of ever to have hosted the World Cup at all. And while there have been investigations at FIFA, they found suspect dealings, but nothing that warranted taking the World Cup away from Qatar. Qatar's always denied wrongdoing, but still various little bits of allegations still continue to emerge. The latest weren't in some, from a reporter or anything even. They were from the DOJ in the States, Department of Justice, and an indictment in the last few months, which talked about potential payments that took place around 2010 linked to World Cup hosting and the vote. In some cases, some of the people are no longer alive. That makes it hard to test all that evidence. But it just shows that the finger of suspicion will linger there. And the World Cup itself is packed into 28 days. There's very little rest time, 4 games a day in some cases in the group stage. And then the European seasons are disrupted. But I think what we've seen during the coronavirus is what real disruption is. And that's no sport at all, no football at all. When we went all those weeks, 100 days in the Premier League with the shutdown, and perhaps it makes us more amenable and accepting of a pause in the season in November, not to shut down completely with no football, but actually just to go off to a FIFA tournament, because, the worst thing in the world is not a World Cup at a different time anymore, but it's having no sport at all. Also the health emergency as well, and of course for all those fans who are perhaps missing going to sport in November and December 2022 in England, in Europe, and other parts of the world, there are always lower league teams, lower league games that will continue in football. Obviously, in a way we don't get in some US sports, all the greatness of the football pyramids in so many countries. And it's a chance maybe to help to support those clubs, particularly those ones that are now struggling because there are no fans there, and hopefully fans be back in and supporting the lifeblood of football, which in so many countries has so many levels of games where fans can go and watch the teams play.
Yeah, I just wanted to come onto a little bit of a personal point of view for you there. You've covered, of course, of course, your work is followed all over the world. I'm sure you must have noticed yourself the kind of responses or replies or sort of a reaction you get from audiences in different corners of the world might actually differ. You'd mentioned you were in India a few years back, about 3 years back. You were in Mumbai as well. So maybe I'll add India to that conversation as well. But primarily on the European and American audiences, for that matter, because we had a chat with Clive Tilsley, and he mentioned a quite interesting anecdote about how the American consumer views football or soccer, for that matter, and how a European consumer views football for them. So it's a completely different, detached manner of supporting your club, and how do I say, culture of following a franchise in the States is very different from what it is about following a clubs in, say, it's in England, or say it's in France or Germany, or for that matter anywhere else. So have you noticed any discernible differences in the consumption pattern of the audiences that you've been serving? Whether it is with any broadcaster who's working in the States, or any broadcaster who's working in England for that matter, and also if you've had to modify your approaches anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of the time, I see it as demystifying complex issues, or hoping to in various cases, which is, explaining how things are being run, how decisions are being reached, and whether that's in broadcasting or I'm writing, it's making it accessible for the masses. We're not there to try to sound, you know, cleverer than the audience is and trying to sort of lead them guessing as to what we mean. I think you see that in Formula One quite a bit. Some of the terminology that's used on broadcast in particular might put off the masses from watching or bringing in new audiences at times. And I think it's important we don't do that. What that doesn't mean is dumbing it down. You don't need to strip out the necessary complexity, because actually fans want to feel smarter. It's why some of the most shared content you sent, particularly from the UK, from the broadcast feed by Sky Sports, are those in-depth analysis pieces when it's Gary Neville, Jamie Carragher, really dissecting a passage of play, or where a player's making mistakes, where he needs to improve, or you know, that sort of level of depth. And we saw it as well in the CBS coverage that Clive was part of the Champions League, where Jamie Carragher was on there. You know, you'd see him at a big screen, really going through moments, stopping, pausing, you know, guiding the viewers through why moments happen, why goals are scored, why defences broke down. They don't want to be patronised in a way. And I think that's what we've seen, particularly with in the States, the way NBC took over the Premier League coverage. And it's a product, it's an analysis that, you know, wouldn't seem out of place if viewed on British television, obviously in the home of the Premier League. And, you know, that was certainly, you got that real authentic football experience by watching the CBS coverage as I was able to. And Clive, you know, did a great job on commentary as well. You know, I actually heard some of his commentary on the Leipzig game where they reached the semi-finals, and he made sure to point out at the moment of reflecting on them about to achieve a remarkable thing, reaching the semi-finals for the first time, that there is some criticism of the way the club is funded, the Red Bull backing, not just trying to sort of gloss over and paint a neat fairy tale, but to show the complexity, which is important to inform the the audiences. I mean, other things that, you know, might require and demand a lot more depth, because you're speaking to an audience that knows the subjects as well, the players and the issues. And that's sort of like any sort of football discussion show that I'm part of in the UK in particular. Often if I'm broadcasting or writing to the world as well, you do need to add more context. They're not broadcasting. It depends, for instance, if I'm talking on a sports show or I'm talking on a news channel as well, which happens where, you know, if you're doing it on a news channel, you know, there are some people who aren't necessarily sporting aficionados are watching that who want something explained. So it's just remembering to insert certain things like not assumed knowledge, like, you know, to even to call things like UEFA, the European football governing body, for those who might not necessarily be in tune with that. So it's moderating your language, you know, how you phrase things. And then for me as well, I write in American English for AP, which goes around the world, which there's some subtle differences in not just the spelling, but also phrases you use, or phrases that don't travel around the world, or words that don't travel, or words that are too British, that don't necessarily resonate around the world, or would confuse. And also when, you know, I'm talking on a North American broadcast, which, you know, hone different language naturally, hopefully, in a way that fits with them, without having to insert American sporting terminology into how you describe a football move or how a goal was scored.
Yeah, these are the things I think, a lot of us fans on the other side of the television, we often don't realize, because the subtle changes that every presenter, every commentator, broadcaster must have to make in order to make sure that he or she is appealing to their audience must be quite a lot. I'm sure there is an incredible amount of preparation that goes into it. Before you present anything for that matter, whether it's a live event or whether it's a pre-recorded event or whether it's simply a chat with an individual. Uh, just as your own perspective, you mentioned at the very start of the interview that you are a massive football fan and everything else. Being a I'll just plainly use it as being someone in the media. Does it become impossible for you to actually keep supporting your club because you won't want the bias to ever reflect in your reporting? And I would never ask you which club you support because that will open you up to even more questions on social media, and we'd never do that. But whichever club it is, has it been have you made a conscious effort to, do you feel that you've made a conscious effort? I'm sure, subliminally you might have, because unconsciously you don't want, sorry, consciously you don't want yourself, the reader, to ever know. Suppose I'm a United fan or I'm a City fan. I don't want the reader to know that if I'm writing something about the Glazers, it's coming from my heart. It's not. I'm trying to be as objective as possible. So has that been an issue for you?
Yeah.
Supporting your own team.
Yeah, I've never felt compromised in any way, writing or reporting on the unnamed team that I support. But it was always, it's Henry Winter who once gave an answer to a fan who asked him who he supports, and he replied England. I think it's pretty. I think it's pretty clear, and not compromising myself in any way to say that as an Englishman, I would be supporting England at a major tournament in terms of wanting them to do well. It doesn't compromise me in any way in terms of what I might have to write. It brings some joy, one day getting to describe their moment of glory, hopefully. But it's something I have no influence on in terms of whether or not they do or don't achieve it. In a way that actually, say, if I came out in support of a particular candidate for FIFA president publicly, and arts coverage towards that, it could actually sway how things do pan out. So you do have to, maintain clear impartiality. And, supporting England, there's been enough writing of the misery of England over the years and about the negativity in terms of how bad performances have been. And I suppose, it's important not to lose perspective as well, even when, they do well. But it also allowed me, for instance, when they did lose to Croatia in the semi-finals in Russia, to reflect on the English psyche, how they got used to sort of coming so near and falling short. Then a year later, I get to see Phil Neville's England team lose another semi-final of the Women's World Cup to the United States. And that was very different as well, because there was sort of, again, perhaps some of the expectation that they could finally reach a final, because the women's team has never done so. But actually, they were up against a far superior side in the US, who obviously went on to win the World Cup. Whereas actually, you could argue Gareth Southgate's England should actually have enough to get past Croatia. But yeah, as for, covering the Premier League week in, week out, it's important to maintain for me to have that sort of neutrality in public. Some journalists, it's hard to hide. They don't hide it because they can't disguise their past. I mean, increasingly, journalists coming through now will have a social media footprint where it's impossible to disguise where necessarily that they do support. And maybe it's some would say it's very, actually, why don't you just disclose who you do support, and then it's sort of out in the open. But I don't feel actually anything I do or don't report on it really adds to it, knowing or not, as people try to. I enjoy people trying to second guess based on what I'm saying or having to say on a particular team, that I must clearly be the opposite or the the rival team or whatever. And it's it's quite entertaining, and actually I see very few people even actually ever actually have found a way of detecting. Well, I'm not trying to leave it as some grand mystery or not. It's I'm not trying to sound like it's probably it's probably just better all round the fact me it's not out there.
I think you're much better off if that it's not known, because it keeps you guarded from a lot of things that you might end up actually writing. whether it's about a club or it's about a national team or for that matter. We'd I think we'd
And
like
actually, I'd
to.
say some of the most interesting moments are actually, always, it doesn't matter who sports, some of the firsts for football. Watching Leicester win the Premier League, and
Yes.
you almost sort of feel, an affinity with it for that moment, and the joy of the fans and the euphoria, or even small teams in the FA Cup
Yes.
when they're sort of doing well, or at the World Cup when it's the newcomers or the Euros, and getting to you can feel sort of that joy of a team winning, just to provide the narrative or the interesting storyline at times as well.
Yes, just like you mentioned, Iceland and Wales in the Euros as well. That must have been a very interesting journey to follow for them as well, because in considering they weren't much heralded nations and did very well in 2016. So, uh, coming to a little more current topic, a little more serious in that manner. We were discussing this prior to the interview. We were discussing about how Mika Richards had to come out and actually you know I won't say he had to apologize, but he had to, had to justify why he is in a position where he is, and justify the knowledge that he possesses and he so successfully imparts, to his audiences. We've seen various instances in the past, especially in the past 3-4 months, wherein a lot of leading sports channels and sports broadcasters have changed some of their experts, or have changed an entire panel of experts. We saw that with Soccer Saturday, if I'm not wrong. And we've seen a lot of people, being moved on. So some of them who were a regular part of the television for 20 years or so, and you see a lot of new faces come in. And of course, with the increase in diversified hiring and everything else, and which is how the world is going in any case. You have a lot of, it doesn't, nothing is restricted to one particular strata of the society. So how do you think football is coping up with the whole BLM movement? We've seen interesting statements from Les Ferdinand yesterday as well.
Mm.
I don't know. I don't know. I won't ask you where you stand on it. I couldn't really answer where I stood on it as well, because I find them very confusing personally. And how do you think? How do you think Mika Richards handled his situation? Because I honestly, like, from a personal level, you feel sorry for him, because why should someone be able to? Someone have to justify how good they are when it's very evident there on the screen.
I mean, on the pure base of who is on screen, it makes a lot of sense to bring in fresh voices, those who actually do their research, and also those who bring a knowledge base in. And I think, you can look across the industry and pundits who perhaps been kept on air for years, who don't have the thoroughness and the depth. And certainly, what Mika's showing is, certainly he's done his research, does his research, works really thoroughly on it. But the fact it's so sad he has to sort of come out publicly to defend himself and to almost justify his position, which he has no need to, because you can see how great and talented he is, in the face of what can only be called racism
Yeah.
from some on social media. And he's clearly someone who has livened up coverage, added a different perspective of depth and insight as well. And some of the removal of figures from shows is perhaps change that some might seem necessary, because shows can get stale as well. And there has been a lack of diversity, and it all can be in tandem. The fact actually you are changing lineup and the necessary diversity, which does not exist in the written media. It's an absolute major issue in the written media in England that covers football, that it's largely white, male-dominated press boxes. And I say that, obviously, myself being amongst that group. I mentioned earlier, for instance, the International Football Board Association meetings that I go to. There's one in February. I was out in Northern Ireland. And afterwards, I was asking about the lack of women involved in the decision making. There was a group picture taken beforehand, and it looked like it was a lot of white men who were taking decisions over the laws of football. So that was, just highlighting the you know, the lack of diversity and all round, as well as gender diversity as well. And there are vital moves, particularly on the written side of the media, to try to diversify those who are coming in through the from the student end. You know, some Sunday I was at Chelsea, Liverpool, and there's a group called Bicoms that they help to sort of get opportunities for young journalists, diverse journalists, to actually get experience in press boxes. So they get to meet other journalists to find a way into the industry as well, and that sort of proactive moves. And I think that's what you actually need: proactive steps, actions all round. And that's the point Les Ferdinand was making, which is it can't just be about gestures. And last year, when they introduced the "No Room for Racism" slogan in the Premier League, about last October, I think, I remember asking the then acting chief executive, now permanent chief executive of the league, Richard Masters, what is this beyond a hashtag? Because you need to actually have some substance. And, you know, over recent quite a few years, I've done some mentoring with the Kick It Out organisation as well, with young journalists at events they run, which is also events where they bring coaches in and young coaches to sort of hear from those who you know, have some experience in the game. And it's all about, you know, on boardroom levels as well, at football clubs and on the benches, ensuring that there's diversity of those who are running the clubs, because actually it helps all the decision making. You know, it helps players to see, you know, they have, you know, they're at clubs where it's not just white men running the clubs, and they can have an affinity as well with some of the issues they might be facing and the changes that might need, whether it's a pushing for greater action from the police in clamping down on abuse online in stadiums, from the governing bodies to introduce tougher sanctions for racial abuse from opposition players, or for banning fans as well. And, you know, I reported them for many years in the build up to the Russia World Cup on the racism there. You know, when Russia won the World Cup in 2010, you know, my first big FIFA events, Vladimir Putin turned up in Zurich. My question to him was about what he was going to do about racism in the country ahead of the World Cup. The Russians then tried to present sort of later on almost like we were just jumping on some sort of bandwagon ahead of the tournament, whereas actually, you know, we've been, you know, trying to raise awareness of these issues. And we're often told it's about education vaguely, but it's also about, you know, what you're taught. There's been quite a focus during the BLM focus in recent months over what is taught in British schools. Oh, you know, our children spoke to about, you know, slavery, the empire, the impacts of so, or is it more modern history, to actually provide that basis for where actually, you know, you do get these long sought out sense of need to change in society. People of colour who you know, who've experienced discrimination and where it comes from going back centuries. And you know, I think you know what is clearly needed is a clear sense of where things are going, rather than vague initiatives. It's a long way from the question on pundits as well, but you know, it's just very sad that it reaches a stage is that you have a small section of people on social media who sometimes, when a black pundit is brought in, just start to go on the attack to say it's just a diversity drive, rather than the fact that actually it's bringing in the most talented people for the job, and to also the important step of diversifying the lineups. I mean, you know, it's football commentators as well in England. It's you know, you know, it's an area like written media that needs increased diversity. And obviously, media perspective, you only sort of feel for the state of the industry at the moment, particularly with the economic term of the consequences of the pandemic and shutdowns, of hoping that the opportunities are there so we can get new talent as well coming into the media industry in particular.
Yes, I completely agree with you there. Another pundit that I really enjoy watching, and who's borne the brunt of this particular, you know, nasty exchange on social media, especially Twitter, is Alex Scott. You know, I'm really impressed with the, you know, level of attention to detail that she goes into. Even if it's the simplest of topics, or if it's a detailed analysis of a match, or an incident in the match. So, you know, one would hope that you'd have more such voices. because you're right, the shows do go stale. And if you have the same voice over and over, and I agree, people do have some sort of an affinity or an attachment to a certain personality, but this, this is the sign of times, and one would hope, we take it forward, make it more inclusive, make it more diverse, because that is the best way to promote the game, to promote the understanding of the game as well. I just realized, that it's been over an hour that we've been speaking, and I know it must be a busy time for you as well. So,
I'll give
this is
away. I have been sort of communicating with colleagues and stuff on my phone necessarily at times to check in.
no.
It's hard to.
I've been receiving texts from my colleagues. You've taken so much of his time. He'll never say yes again for an interview.
Absolutely, it's great to opt this, particularly because it's a chance to be out in the sun as well, knowing that certainly for the next couple of weeks there isn't much on offer as well. So it's certainly a good reason to be, and it's good to be able to chat and exchange perspectives on the world of football.
Yes, Rob. I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation for me as well. I could really go on because there are so many things we could actually talk about, but I would rather do this. I'd rather request you for a follow-up interview, maybe a couple of months down the line when we have a better perspective of COVID, and also hopefully when we have lesser such instances such as Mika Richards' talk yesterday as well. Once again, thank you so much, Rob. We're so grateful that you joined us, and it's been a pleasure. Let me just add it for our viewers, and I'm sure when you actually do watch this interview, you'll realize why he's such a massively successful broadcaster. The way he presents, the way he speaks, is just fabulous. And Rob, as a listener myself, it was encapsulating listening to you, and I would love to have the opportunity to do a follow-up interview on this. And once again, all the best. I hope the things become better in the UK rather than going towards lockdown phase. I hope this is not the last time for a long time that you have in the sun.
Absolutely, and keep well, and hopefully we do this face to face at some point as well.
Yes. Hopefully, with the travel restrictions up, coming over there or coming over here, hopefully that will happen maybe next year, I suppose.
Good to speak.
Good to speak with you. Thank you so much. Rob. It was indeed a pleasure.